They used to say the soil of Orisun was so rich that when the rains came, the earth sang. It sang in copper and cobalt, in gold dust and black oil, in forests that breathed out thunder and valleys that whispered grain. But for a long time, only a handful heard the music, and those few sold the song. In the capital, old men in immaculate agbadas and neatly knotted ties learned how to silence the earth. They signed papers with invisible ink, deals whispered in hotel rooms where the chandeliers never blinked and the curtains never opened. The contracts were written in a language that called theft stability, bribes facilitation, and land opportunity zones. The signatures always looked like scythes. They smiled for the cameras while the lights were on. When the lights went off, their phones lit up with messages from overseas numbers. "Expedite," the messages said. "Expedite, and you will be remembered." They were remembered, just not as they hoped. The first door was under the harbor, where foreign ships arrived at night and left before dawn. They were registered to places that were not places, countries that fit inside mailboxes, turquoise-colored flags fluttering above hollow companies. Their cargo manifests were crisp and clean. Machinery, paper, research equipment, while the cranes lifted drums of rare earth metals and crates of uncut stones, slick with river mud. A local customs chief, plump with holiday bonuses in July, ticked every box cleared. He built a mansion with 20 rooms and slept in one. The other 19 hummed with the emptiness of unasked questions. The second door lay beneath the forest canopy, in the hush where the parrots watched men sink steel teeth into the soil. The machines roared like a storm that never stopped. At the edges of concessions, red ribbons tied to trees marked invisible lines that crawled forward each week. When rangers complained, a packet of money arrived, folded crisp. When activists wrote reports, a stranger followed them home and leaned on their door while smoking a cigarette that smelled like threat. The third door was in the ministry, an office with a floor so polished it reflected the ceilings like a second sky. There, advisors from faraway capitals tutored local ministers on modernization. They suggested pegging the currency to a borrowed promise, structuring debt like nested dolls, and privatizing public things until public meant nothing. They presented slides with arrows that only ever pointed outward: resources out, profits out, future out. In the corner of those slides, there was always a small box labeled social responsibility, as if a conscience could be fitted into an appendix. And in every door, behind every glossy word, stood the same figures: the old politician and his circle, pockets deep, bellies fed, mouths smooth. They had perfected a new colonization with local accents. In the fishing town of Ajanla, the elders remembered when the sea ran silver with sardines. Then the rigs came, and the glow of flares burned the night into a permanent dusk. A boy named Tayo watched his father's boat come back empty each week. In the slick season, when rain drummed on corrugated roofs, oil would rise like a shadow from the waves and stain the shoreline. The company said it was natural seepage. Tayo learned to count by tallying dead fish. In the northern savannah, a village called Kambari woke to a convoy of trucks that looked like a moving wall. Men with papers declared the land under lease. They offered shiny tools and contracts printed in a font so tight it looked like barbed wire. A grandmother named Hajara traced her finger over the signatures and said, "These are not our names." The bulldozers came anyway. The well turned brackish, and the wind learned a new taste: dust and diesel and the tin-bitten tang of broken promises. In the mountain town of Owelu, the schoolyard doubled as a clinic. The doctor there, a woman named Adezi, treated coughs that never left and bruises that came from nowhere. She kept 2 prescription pads, one for medicine, one for letters pleading for electricity so vaccines didn't spoil and the ultrasound didn't stutter. At night, she read by the light of her phone about growth trajectories and GDP rebounds and asked herself if numbers could ever be honest about hunger. In the city, a journalist named Zainab received a hard drive slipped into the pocket of her coat on a crowded bus. It was filled with spreadsheets resembling spider webs. Subsidiaries paying subsidiaries, royalties to addresses that were just doors with no rooms behind them. She published, and the old men called her agitated. Her landlord called her late. The electric company called her disconnected. And everywhere, there were stories of mercenaries who arrived with crisp uniforms and no history, consultants hired to protect investments. They trained militias and called it capacity building. They fenced off rivers and called it safety. They escorted caution tape around the ruins of sacred groves and called it progress. The old politicians gathered in a wood-paneled room that smelled of imported tobacco and polished gilt. They spoke in a language both local and foreign. Floor price, production sharing, loss carry forward. They joked about the indignity of small bribes and debated the elegance of large ones. Their laughter had the softness of velvet stretched over iron. They told themselves a story, that nation-building required sacrifice, and that the nation was a body, and they were the belly. The belly must be fed first, they reasoned, or the body collapses. Meanwhile, the people told another story, that the nation was a bowl, and every hand should touch it, and those who filled it last sat closest to the fire. The distance between belly and bowl became a canyon, where hope fell and did not echo. The superheroes didn't arrive wearing capes. They arrived wearing dust and data. They called themselves the Weavers because they believed a nation was a fabric, and fabric is strongest where threads cross and hold. They were students and apprentices, coders and carpenters, midwives and mechanics. They met in borrowed classrooms and under mango trees. They built their headquarters not in a fortress, but in a market where life never stopped negotiating. The Weavers decided their first weapon would be light. They created the People's Ledger, an open, tamper-evident record that could run on a solar-powered server and fit on a memory card in a pocket. Every royalty payment, every export, every permit and tender, recorded in plain language, auditable by anyone with eyes. They trained grandmothers to use it with the same patience required to teach a needle a new path through fabric. At first, the old politicians laughed. Children and their toys, they said. But the ledger-linked ship manifests to mining volumes, to community budgets, to mysteriously vanishing line items. The Weavers made heat maps that glowed red where nothing glowed at night. People started showing up at town halls with questions printed on paper, names spelled correctly, decimals aligned like soldiers. The laughter thinned. The Weavers' second weapon was breath. They toured the country with a caravan of teachers and storytellers and mediators. In the fishing town of Ajanla, they convened a water parliament, fishers, rig managers, scientists, chiefs, and children. Tayo stood and told them about counting dead fish. He did not cry. The rig managers, unused to conversations where their words had consequences, sat straighter. The water parliament drafted rules that fit the tides instead of the boardroom. They installed real-time monitors at discharge points with feeds open to everyone, including the children. The oil company declared it a pilot. The weavers declared it a precedent. The third weapon was patience, sharpened into law. Young lawyers, some trained abroad, all trained by reality, rewrote tender processes with teeth. They introduced clauses that made communities shareholders, not spectators. They reserved a percentage of profits for a sovereign future fund that couldn't be touched without a supermajority of local councils, not Parliament alone. They created a right of return for land once extraction was done, restoration budgets locked before the first shovel touched soil. When the old politicians tried to stall, the weavers brought witnesses with them, farmers with cracked hands, teachers with missing chalk, a midwife who had delivered a baby by candlelight and named the child Ida, the one who will testify. They broadcast proceedings on loudspeakers and live streams. The silence of the chandelier rooms was punctured by the sound of 1,000 tuned-in ears. Change, when it came, did not arrive like a single sunrise. It came like mornings linked by stubbornness. The First Minister fell on a Tuesday, after Zainab published bank statements that sang in numbers even the uninterested could hear. He declared the documents forged. The bank declared them authentic. His driver declared he had always suspected. The minister left the courthouse through a side door, his cufflinks catching the light like small handcuffs that had learned to glitter. He went home to a house with 19 empty rooms and found them full of questions. Foreign partners tested the weavers' resolve. A mining conglomerate offered to donate a world-class stadium in exchange for a quiet extension of their concession. The weavers counter-offered a world-class soil remediation lab, a community-owned refinery with zero-flare tech, and a training institute for process engineers, all paid by the company, all governed by citizens. The company balked. The youth shrugged and published the story. Overnight, shares trembled. 2 weeks later, the company returned with a new humility and a better pen. Mercenaries tried to intimidate. They found drones humming like bees above illegal pits, cameras whose footage flowed straight into the people's ledger, and communities who had rehearsed how to stand together without flinching. A village in Kambari lined their dusty road with calabashes filled with clean water. When the convoy stopped, children offered cups. The mercenaries drank and were seen. It is hard to disappear people who have been witnessed drinking from your bowl. The national broadcaster, long a megaphone for the well-fed, ran a debate where every old politician spoke in polished paragraphs and every weaver answered with verbs: build, audit, restore, teach, seed. And the people, who had been asked for patience their whole lives but never given tools, began to feel something new: leverage. In the second year, Orisun opened a green refinery powered by sun and sea wind. It processed the nation's ores without choking the sky, and its profits flowed into a public dashboard like rainfall tracked in a drought. That dashboard wasn't just numbers, it was stories. A clinic wing opening in Owelu with vaccines cold and bright. A network of libraries where girls named their favorite book aloud into the ledger's microphone. A microgrid in a janla that pulsed at night with the steady heartbeat of refrigerators that kept fish fresh and dreams from spoiling. Every citizen received a dividend, a small one at first, then larger, paid in a stable, digital tender, tethered not to foreign policy whims, but to baskets of what Orisun grew and made. Prices stopped lurching, like frightened animals. Land once stripped was replanted with native trees, whose names grandparents taught to grandchildren under the shade of their return. The youth refused the myth of a single savior. They elected councils where seats were reserved for those who cleaned as well as those who coded, for midwives as well as mathematicians. They wrote a constitution that specified stewardship the way other nations specified conquest. It spoke of rivers as legal persons and of future generations as stakeholders who could sue the present. It honored elders without surrendering to them. It made greed expensive. Corruption did not disappear. It learned fear. When a governor awarded a contract to his cousin under a new name, the ledger hiccuped, a quiet ding, and a dozen citizen auditors assembled like rain. They didn't carry machetes. They carried questions precise as scalpels. The cousin withdrew. The governor learned that shame, applied consistently, was a disinfectant. The youth also learned to say no to friends. A weaver who had spent long months sleeping on floors to build the ledger was caught inflating a budget. She confessed, resigned, returned the money, and began again as a trainer in a rural district where no one knew her face, but everyone knew her story. Redemption became a path, not a performance. Not all elders were villains. Some had been trapped so long in the gears of a machine they mistook its grind for gravity. An elder statesman named Baba Femi, famed for speeches that outlived their verbs, asked to visit the green refinery. The weavers welcomed him like a grandfather and questioned him like a patient. "Who taught you power?" they asked. "Who taught you fear?" He sat for hours, unburdening the bargains he had made, the impossible budgets, the midnight calls from foreign banks, the funerals no one filmed. He left with a thin booklet the weavers had been giving to schoolchildren. How to read a contract. It was printed in 5 languages and 2 alphabets. On the last page, there was a drawing of a bowl and a belly, with arrows showing how both could be full. Some old politicians fled to the same overseas cities where their money slept. Others stayed and stood for trial. A few returned quietly to their hometowns and planted trees whose roots whispered to the soil, "Forgive us. We forgot your song." It was part policy summit, part music party, part court of the people. Delegations came from nations that had long sent ships and now sent questions. A panel titled "Profit After People, Impossible by Design" trended around the world. Another, led by midwives, taught finance ministers how to breathe during contractions. On the festival's final night, under a sky looking like the inside of a drum, Zainab stood on stage with Adaze and Tayo and Hajara and 100 others whose names had always been power but had never been called. The lights were simple, warm bulbs strung like constellations at human height. Once, Zainab said, we were told that our future was a queue, leading out of ourselves, that every good thing waited offshore, offshore, offshore. We believed them. We lined up and left. But the queue led us back here, to a place that does not ask us to shrink to fit. Adaizi held up a baby born in the clinic's new wing, cheeks plump with subsidies made honest. The crowd laughed. Tayo spoke of fish returning, not as miracle, but as math. Emissions down, mangroves replanted, nets repaired, markets cooled. Hajara told a story about naming a wind and being heard by it. Then the youth, the weavers whose capes were their calluses, spoke together. Their voices braided, not in unison, but in harmony. We are not the future, they said. We are the floor on which the future will dance. We will be outsmarted, and we will learn. We will be tempted, and we will shame ourselves back to honor. We will be tired, and we will rest, without forgetting. We will treat resources like elders, not like prey. We will become the kind of powerful that holds gently. We will make a country that our grandchildren will not have to forgive. The earth of Orisun, rinsed by rains that had always tried to sing, answered. The forest exhaled. The refinery hummed without smoke. The port tallied lawful cargo, and the ledger glowed like a hearth. Far away, old empires frowned and recalculated. They sent emissaries with softer tongues and newer deals. Orisun welcomed them with daylight meetings and open microphones. "We are not against partnership," the weavers said, smiling. "We are against forgetting who we are." The bowl passed. Every hand touched it. The belly was full, yes, but not first, and not alone. And on a morning like any other, a turning concealed in routine, children walked to schools whose roofs did not leak, where a subject called civics and soil taught them both how to plant and how to vote. In a classroom by the sea, a poster read, "A resource is a promise. A promise is a resource. Keep both." The earth of Orisun sang. This time, the whole country listened.